Dear Ambassador, greetings and nice to see you on First Western.
It's good to be with you.
We'll start our conversation with the upcoming OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, which is scheduled on 23rd of February and will take place in Austria. Unfortunately, Russian delegation will participate in the event because Austria granted visas for them, despite the fact that they're all sanctioned by the European Union. What is US government position towards it, and do you personally support participation of Russian delegation in the upcoming session?
Well, look, first of all, I don't control what the Parliamentary Assembly does. I'm the ambassador to the OSCE. So it's our members of Congress who interact with other parliamentarians throughout the OSCE region to discuss the business of the Parliamentary Assembly. That said, I will tell you that all of these individuals from the Russian delegation who have been sanctioned for very good reasons. These are not good people. These are people who have engaged in all sorts of illegal activities or who have been conduits of Russian propaganda. So there's a reason why they're on both the US and the European sanctions lists. As for their visas, look, that's a matter for the Austrian government. They've made a decision, as I understand it, to grant these individuals visas. I don't see any merits to having any sort of discussion with these folks because, frankly, they're just Kremlin mouthpieces. They don't articulate anything other than lies, misinformation, and propaganda. So they will be here. So what can we do in the meantime? I think the best solution that I could hope to see from this Parliamentary Assembly is for all the assembled parliamentarians from Vancouver all the way to Central Asia to roundly condemn Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. That would be the best outcome given where we are right now.
But did the US government or US ambassador try to prevent it, for example, at least to ask Austrian government not to grant them visa through diplomatic channels, maybe as it did Poland and Great Britain when such assemblies were held in their countries?
Well, look, I won't get into our diplomatic correspondence with my Austrian colleagues. We have discussed the matter, but what I will say is, this is their decision. It's their sovereign choice. As I have said earlier, we supported the decisions of both Poland and the UK to refuse visas to those who were sanctioned by those respective governments. In this case, the Austrian authorities decided that they would grant visas, and that was their prerogative.
Don't you think that participation of Russian delegation in such event in the Europe just makes Russia less isolated on the world stage?
Well, I certainly agree with the thrust of your question, which is that they don't deserve to be listened to at this moment in time. I think it was Golda Meir of Israel who said that, one doesn't negotiate with those who are coming to kill you. And certainly there's no scope for any sort of negotiation or genuine dialogue or discussion with these folks. As I said earlier, they're bad people, and frankly, I think it would be better if they were not here. But they are. And so I think the best thing for the rest of the parliamentary delegates to do is to roundly condemn them and to isolate them and make sure that they hear very strong voices of condemnation.
Sure, they're wrong, they're bad people, but Western countries are still continuing to speaking with them. For example, Russia is still member of OSCE, and Western countries, what are they really talking about with Russian representatives, with Russian delegation on OSCE? It's just interesting for me. How does it look like discussion with Russian counterparts in that time when they're attacking our cities by numerous missile attacks? Their soldiers are still committing war crimes, atrocities through Ukraine, and they every day violate UN Charter.
Yeah. So here's what it looks like at the OSCE. Every week we have a meeting of the Permanent Council and of the Forum for Security Cooperation, And in every single one of those meetings, the United States, together with some of our European allies and partners, exposes Russia's war crimes in Ukraine. We talk about potential crimes against humanity. We talk about the mass atrocities. We talk about the filtration process. In fact, we've brought to Vienna on a number of occasions the survivors of Russia's filtration operations in Ukraine, including those who have been held in captivity at Azovstal and other Ukrainian heroes, so that the world can hear what Russia is doing in Ukraine, namely that it is trying to wipe out an independent sovereign nation state from the map of Europe. So we do that. We talk about that every week. And I have to say, Russia and Belarus are completely isolated. No other country, and I have to repeat this, no other country here supports their narrative. It is only Russia and Belarus who support each other. So that's the situation as it is. Just so your viewers understand, the OSCE was created in the early 90s. At the end of the Cold War in a very different geopolitical era. And at the time, no mechanism was created to expel a member from the organization or, frankly, to suspend it. And so we're kind of stuck with the organization we have, and we have to make the best use of it. Do I like the fact that the Russians are here? No, I do not. And I would rather not grant them any platform to espouse their propaganda. But we have to make do with what we have.
And what they're answering for your question during this regular meetings, they're only sharing their propaganda views, and Kremlin doesn't.
They feel so uncomfortable that usually the ambassador does not show up. He sends a second secretary or a third secretary to stand in his place, and usually they don't respond to what we say. So, in effect, they hear what we say, but they don't dare to respond because they know the truth.
So, if they don't respond to your messages, why they should be a member of OSCE? Does the United States support?
Well, the reality, as I just said, is that they shouldn't be. They shouldn't be a good standing member of any organization. But as I said to you earlier, there's no mechanism in the OSCE to expel any country. And if you expel one, then the entire organization falls apart. So we continue to do work on the ground in Central Asia and the Western Balkans. And indeed, now we have a brand new field mission in Ukraine that will focus on things like demining, psychosocial support to those affected by the war, mitigating the environmental risks of the war, and helping build resilience for infrastructure. And of course, probably one of the projects that is nearest and dearest to my heart is trying to help Ukrainian authorities with reuniting children who have been separated from their families and deported to Russia. So we've stood up this field mission only with our like-minded partners. We've created it so that Russia does not have a veto for the first time ever in the history of this organization. So we don't want to lose the good things that we do by dissolving the organization. Instead, we can isolate Russia and Belarus both politically and diplomatically, and that's what we're doing.
But don't you think that organization is ineffective because it couldn't prevent war, and now it?
No, I don't buy that argument one bit. So I'm going to stop you right there. Look, if the world's nuclear superpowers couldn't prevent this war, how can you expect an organization that has unarmed observers to stop anything? I mean, that's just complete bunk. It's like saying that, the carpenters and the architects and the electricians who built a house are somehow responsible for the arsonist who burned the house down. That's not the case. And it's not the case with the OSCE either.
So OSCE renewed their project and activity in Ukraine after the Russian veto.
That's correct. Russia vetoed the previous 3 field missions in Ukraine on the border with Russia, the Special Monitoring Mission, and what was called the Project Coordinator in Ukraine. And after having vetoed all of the OSCE presence in Ukraine, those of us who were like-minded, led by the United States, together with our partners, decided that enough is enough. We need to find a mechanism to create an OSCE mission in Ukraine that is veto-proof. And so we established this concept of a mission that is funded entirely through the contributions of those states who desire to contribute, including first and foremost the United States. We had the chair of the organization select a leader for that mission. It's Ambassador Henrik Vladsen of Denmark. And that mission is now operational. It's on the ground in Kyiv. It has about 60, 70 or so staff members. And they will continue to work in the areas that are priorities for the Ukrainian government.
Speaking about activity of Russia on international stage, Russia is still member of the United Nations and United Nations Security Platform. Ukraine initiated a procedure to expel Russia from UN Security Council and United Nations because, as our Minister of Foreign Affairs said, Russia illegally captured their place. Does the United States support to exclude Russia from the United Nations because it still violates UN Charter and principles of international law?
So, look, the UN is not really my area of responsibility, but my colleague, Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield, has said very clearly that she would rather that the Russia that violates all the basic tenets of the UN Charter were not participating in the UN. But again, there's not a mechanism or a clear legal pathway to expelling Russia. And so I think it's important that a viable path be identified to hold Russia to account for what it's done in Ukraine. And that work is ongoing. At some point, I think in the not too distant future, when it comes to organizations like the UN, like the OSCE, we'll have to find a way to recalibrate the way that we do business. And some of the rules and procedures that were set up in the UN system in, say, 1945, 46, and some of the procedures set up in the OSCE in 1990, 1991, 1992, will have to be re-examined, so that if we face this situation in the future, we have better tools available to hold states to account. But one last thing I want to say on this is, look, Russia has been expelled from the Council of Europe. So there's the other example of what can possibly happen. And I don't think that it's necessarily the best example, because as a result, Russian citizens who are dissidents or Ukrainians who experience repression from the Russian state no longer have recourse to the European Court of Human Rights. So there's pluses and minuses to expelling states from organizations. When you keep them in the organization, you also have the ability to hold them accountable, and that's of great benefit.
Speaking about accountability, do you support and does the United States support the creation of special tribunal for war crimes and war crime of aggression of Russia, for Russian leadership, Russian president, Russian soldiers? Do you support such a mechanism of accountability for Russia?
Yes, we support all different accountability platforms. It's important to distinguish between the crime of aggression and war crimes and crimes against humanity. The existing International Criminal Court has the ability to prosecute war crimes, as does the Ukrainian Prosecutor General, which is why the United States is contributing financially to building capacity for the Ukrainian Prosecutor General so that his staff can take on the bulk of the war crimes cases that they are able to prosecute inside the country. The ICC will obviously have jurisdiction over a number of war crimes cases, and then the crime of aggression is a separate issue. It is one for which there currently is no international accountability mechanism, and there we need to find the most solid, sustainable legal basis to ensure that any future tribunal can withstand scrutiny and can in fact prosecute the crime of aggression.
Speaking about sanctions and Russian assets which are frozen in the European Union and in the United States, does the US government support to confiscate their assets and provide them to Ukraine to rebuild our economy, infrastructure, and our country?
Yeah, this is a crucial issue, and the United States does support looking at various legal mechanisms through which we can use seized assets belonging to the Russian state. Now, this is tricky legal ground, and so once again, the legal framework has to be developed further. Right now, I would say it's premature to say that we know exactly how this would work, but certainly there is a lot of sympathy for using seized assets to ensure that Ukraine is made whole after this war, which will result in massive costs for infrastructure repair and reconstruction. So yes, generally speaking, the principle of reparations or of some form of indemnity is supported, but we have to look at the precise legal mechanism to do so.
Does the United States government can support us as long as it takes, as Biden administration said, due to latest Congress election? As you know, there are some Republicans there do not fully support our country. Do you think that Biden administration could really support us as long as it takes?
Yes, and I hope that as long as it takes is not too much longer. I hope that Ukraine can win this war in the very near term, meaning by the end of this year or as fast as humanly possible. The longer this war drags on, I think the worse it is for, first of all, for Ukrainian soldiers, but also Ukrainian civilians who suffer from Russian attacks. So we want to put an end to this war, but we want to do it so that Ukraine can liberate its territories. Because as long as Russia occupies Ukrainian land, we'll continue to see filtration operations, torture, mistreatment, extrajudicial killings, and so on. But we have the capacity, together with our allies and partners, we have the capacity to support Ukraine militarily, with equipment, with financial resources. And as my president has said, we will do that for as long as it is necessary.
And what is, in your opinion, endgame for Ukrainian war? Where it could end? On the negotiations table, on the battlefield, or somewhere else?
Look, I think the end game is pretty simple. It's for Russian forces to get out of Ukrainian territory. It's pretty black and white. They need to leave. They had no business being there in the first place. They invaded your land, and so they should leave. Obviously, they're going to have to be compelled to leave, and that means that the war on the battlefield will continue on for some time. Ultimately, there may or may not be some sort of negotiation at the end of this war. It's hard to envisage exactly what that looks like. But when the time comes, Ukraine needs to be operating from a position of strength, where it determines what its interests are vis-a-vis Russia.
So it could be achieved by U.S. security assistance to Ukrainian army and our soldiers.
Well, indeed. I mean, we have now provided over $30 billion worth, billion with a B, dollars worth of security assistance to Ukraine. And I know that the administration of President Biden is prepared to do more. So we will continue to support Ukraine going forward. Absolutely.
Thank you, Ambassador, for your pro-Ukrainian position. And last question will be about Marshall Plan for Ukraine. Could such plan be adopted before the end of war or only after the end of war? And will the US government really pursue to adopt such actions, adopt such plan, and together with allies try to rebuild our country?
Well, of course, the United States and our allies will support the rebuilding and reconstruction of Ukraine after the war. My hope is that 10 years or 20 years or 30 years from now, when a new generation of Russians and Ukrainians looks back at the history of this war, they see this as an unmitigated strategic catastrophe for the Russian Federation. And they understand that Ukraine was able to come out of this war, albeit with enormous human costs and humanitarian costs, but on a stronger footing as a sovereign, independent nation that is charting its own future. That's the only way to prevent these sorts of tragedies from happening in the future, is to ensure that there's a clear victor and a clear loser.
And after victory, could US provide Ukraine with serious security guarantees like membership in NATO or bilateral security guarantees?
Right. Well, the question here is, as you know, there is likely to be a period of time before Ukraine is admitted to NATO. At some point, Ukraine, in my humble estimation, will absolutely become a member of the NATO alliance. But there will likely be a period of time, and I can't predict for you exactly how long, when Ukraine is still not yet in the alliance, but on the way. And in that intermediate period, we need to devise a set of security assurances, and a package of support measures that will give Ukraine, that will allow it to create greater defense and deterrence capabilities so that Russia is unable to relaunch a war. Because, look, we're under no illusions that President Putin, as soon as there's a ceasefire, we're not under the illusion that he will stop. He will likely try to continue to attack Ukraine and take further territory on terms that are beneficial to him. And so we need to ensure that Ukraine has a lasting, sustainable military advantage so that it can deter Russia from future invasions.
And such an advantage could be achieved by giving us all possible weapons like fighter jets, long-range missiles without any...
By giving Ukraine the military edge, the advantage that it needs to be able to deter a subsequent Russian invasion. And then one day, as I said, I am confident, although I can't predict for you when it'll happen, but I am confident that Ukraine will become a member of NATO. And then when that day happens, of course, as you know, NATO's Article 5 guarantee or provision for collective defense allows for the entire alliance to come together to support any NATO ally that is under threat.
Thanks, Ambassador, for being with us today. Thank you for your time and glory to Ukraine.
Thank you. Героям слава.